Amnesty International slams European Union policy as migrant boats are barred from ports. Scientists search the jungle to save wild coffee species before it's too late. And in our Music Makers segment, one of Togo's hottest young stars, Santrinos. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gido. You're in for Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. Amnesty International has described as shameful the decision by several European states to block NGO migrant rescue ships from docking in their port. The human rights group says Europe's migrant policy is putting lives in danger, both at sea and in Libya, where most of the asylum seekers set out to try to reach Europe. Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
We have a safe port. We're going in. C'est fini.
After 19 days at sea, these migrants were finally allowed ashore in Malta earlier this month. The NGO ships that rescued them had repeatedly been refused permission to dock by Italy, Malta and other European countries. Amnesty says it stems from Europe's decision to, in their words, outsource border security to Libya.
This has led European governments to rely on the Libyan Coast Guard not only to intercept ships of refugees and migrants at sea, but also to coordinate the rescues. The only thing that the Libyan Coast Guard can tell NGOs is to go back to Libya and disembark people there. But it is forbidden by international law to disembark people in a place where they are going to be exposed to torture.
Many European countries, notably Italy, have ended their own rescue missions in the Mediterranean, so NGO boats have stepped in. But southern European states like Italy and Malta have barred them from docking and disembarking the migrants.
There is no mechanism enabling European governments, European states, to share responsibility among them for the assistance of those asylum seekers.
Spain this week blocked the Proactiva open arms rescue vessel from leaving port, action that drew praise from Italy.
If the European Union and the other European countries will follow up words with actions, Europe will be rescued. But as the Prime Minister said, if words will not be followed by actions, Europe doesn't exist.
The EU says the flow of migrants to Europe is down 92% from its peak in 2015. The populist narrative of Europe threatened by migration is simply false, says Amnesty.
And rather than challenging this on the basis of the real data, many governments seem to favor this kind of perception, this kind of fake news environment in which constituencies believe they are under siege.
Malta says 7 European countries have agreed to take in some of the 300 migrants that have disembarked on its shores since December. But with anti-migrant governments in power in several EU member states, Brussels appears a long way from agreeing a permanent mechanism of refugee quotas. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
Sudanese police on Friday clashed with mourners during the funeral of a 60-year-old protester who died from a gunshot wound sustained during a 5th week of anti-government demonstrations. Police fired live ammunition after some mourners hurled rocks and chanted slogans demanding an end to the 30-year rule of President Omar al-Bashir. They also used tear gas against protesters in another part of Khartoum and the city of Omdurman on the other side of the River Nile. Earlier, around 5,000 mourners turned out for the funeral and burial of Mawaia Othman, who was shot late on Thursday. The wave of protests in Sudan began on December 19th over the price hikes for basic commodities, but quickly turned into demonstrations against Bashir. Bashir has blamed the unrest on foreign agents and challenged his opponents to seek power through the ballot box instead. The Democratic Republic of Congo government on Friday rejected an African Union demand to delay the announcement of final results from its disputed presidential election. In a surprise announcement on Thursday, the African Union chief Moussa Faki Mahamat called for the results to be postponed, expressing serious doubts over the conduct of the election. Provisional results announced last week showed a shocking victory for an opposition leader, Felix Tshisekedi. But his opponent, Martin Fayulu, requested a recount, saying he had won with over 60% of the vote and that Tshisekedi was announced victor only after striking a deal with outgoing President Joseph Kabila. The election was supposed to mark Congo's first democratic handover of power in 59 years of independence. The final tally is set to be released once the Constitutional Court has ruled on challenges to the provisional results. Human Rights Watch says people around the world are confronting the abuses of autocrats and pushing back against intolerant populists. In its annual report, the advocacy group says 2018 saw growing opposition to authoritarian trends in Western democracies, as well as countries with traditionally controlling governments. And as VOA's Ladza Hawk reports, groups often organize to support the rights of people in other countries.
Hundreds of protesters marched toward the presidential palace in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on Thursday, chanting freedom, peace and justice and demanding President Omar al-Bashir's resignation. Bashir took power in a 1989 coup and has ruled with an iron fist since then.
If you're an autocrat, it's very convenient to violate human rights. It's the way you stay in power. It's the way you fill up your bank account. It's the way you pay off your cronies. So there are reasons why governments want to violate human rights.
Human Rights Watch notes that voters in Malaysia and the Maldives ousted their corrupt prime ministers. Armenia's prime minister stepped down amid massive protests over corruption. And Ethiopia, under popular pressure, replaced a long abusive government with a prime minister who embarked on an impressive reform agenda. Ruling with an iron fist is harder in a Western democracy, but some global developments, including mass migration, have spurred populism and given rise to authoritarian leaders such as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Polish President Andrzej Duda. People in both countries have reacted against what they saw as an attack on freedoms. In the United States, the report says, voters rejected fear-mongering policies by President Donald Trump.
If you look around the world, there is pushback at the popular level, too. I mean, even in the United States, the midterm elections were a big rebuke to Trump's divisive policies. So a lot of this is bottom-up, but it's also top-down. It's also governmental leaders who say democracy, human rights, the rule of law, these are important.
Germany, Denmark and Finland stopped arms sales to Saudi Arabia following the killing of Saudi writer Jamal Khashoggi. But the news is not all good. The report says human rights abuse has worsened in China, where 1 million Uyghur Muslims have been detained for so-called re-education.
Now, if any other country were doing this, it would be an outrage. But China, because of its economic clout, has been getting away with this.
Human Rights Watch says conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Myanmar and elsewhere enable authoritarian rulers to commit large-scale atrocities against civilians caught in the middle. Zlatica Hawk, VOA News, Washington.
Zimbabwe remains under an internet blackout on Friday after authorities extended a communications ban to cover emails as the United Nations calls for an end to a security crackdown on civilians triggered by days of deadly protests. The government has said 3 people died during demonstrations that broke out on Monday after President Emmerson Mnangagwa raised fuel prices by 150%. Lawyers and activists say the death toll was much higher and that security forces used violence and carried out mass arrests to quell the unrest. In Geneva, the UN Human Rights Office called on the government to stop the crackdown and denounced allegations of generalized intimidation and harassment of protesters. Authorities have yet to respond to allegations of a crackdown, but many Zimbabweans believe President Mnangagwa is falling back on the tactics of his predecessor, Robert Mugabe, by using intimidation to crush dissent. International Criminal Court appeals judges delayed the release of ex-Ivorian leader Laurent Gbagbo on Friday ordering that he be held for at least 2 more weeks after being acquitted on crimes against humanity charges. Trial judges said Tuesday that prosecutors had failed to link Gbagbo, who has spent 7 years in custody in The Hague, to election-related violence in 2010 and 2011, in which some 3,000 people were killed. But Friday's decision by the 5-member appeals panel means Gbagbo and his co-defendant, former youth minister Charles Blegude, will continue to be held, at least until the appeals panel has reviewed the trial chamber's decision to release them. A new court date was set for February 1st. Gbagbo's acquittal was deplored by victims groups representing those who died in violence during the 2010 election, in which Gbagbo refused to concede defeat to his rival Alassane Ouattara. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the unrest that prosecutors blamed on Gbagbo, and victims fear his return home could revive hostilities in Abidjan. Rising temperatures, changing rainfall, and encroaching diseases are threatening the world's coffee crops. A new study reveals that many of coffee's wild relatives, which could help the crop adapt to a warmer world, are also at risk. Here's VOA's Steve Baragona.
It's a really long way to go for coffee. But the coffee these scientists are looking for, you won't find at your local cafe. This is a rare wild relative that grows in the jungles of Sierra Leone. Coffee has 124 of these cousins across tropical Africa and Asia. But 60% of the family is at risk of extinction, says Aaron Davis, head of coffee research at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew.
So the main threat to the world's coffee species is deforestation. And that's because most coffee species actually occur in forests.
Those forest species may fight off diseases better than domesticated coffees, or they may do better in a drought, or they may tolerate higher temperatures better. Davis says those traits are increasingly important as the planet heats up.
The species we grow occur in very narrow climatic envelopes. That means that as the climate changes, as temperatures increase and rainfall decreases, the suitable area for growing this coffee diminishes.
That means trouble for coffee-producing countries, where the bean is a major source of income. An estimated 100 million small farmers worldwide grow coffee. Climate change threatens wild coffee, too. That's why Davis and his colleagues are searching the jungles for them now.
We don't want to be in the situation where we find ourselves requiring some wild plant or some wild genes, only to find that actually it's extinct in the wild.
Davis and colleagues say there's no time to waste. Their new study found nearly half of all coffee species are absent from the world's seed banks. Steve Baragona, VOA News.
We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Still ahead on Africa 54, Togolese performer Kwame Santarinos. We'll be right back.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about, sharing stories of development and growth across Africa, around the world, and in our lives. Topics that inform, empower, and change the rules. It's time for Our Voices with me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
It's time for Our Voices.
U.S. President Donald Trump is reported to have directed his attorney to lie to Congress about efforts to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. The account on BuzzFeed News says 2 anonymous federal law enforcement officials were the sources for the report about the president and his former lawyer, Michael Cohen. The sources say Cohen told Special Counsel Robert Mueller that the president told him to lie to Congress about Trump's dealings with Russia. At the same time, Cohen was providing the Trumps with news about the negotiations with Russia. Trump was engaged in his successful presidential election and denying that he had any business deals with Russia. Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team of prosecutors have been investigating Trump campaign links to Russia for 20 months, and also whether Trump, as president, obstructed justice by trying to thwart their probe. It's unclear if the 28-day U.S. government shutdown is moving toward an end, but what is known is that the stalemate is brewing contentious political standoffs. President Donald Trump's forced cancellation of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's planned trip to Afghanistan and Brussels Thursday is the latest maneuver. Pelosi and members of Congress returned to the Capitol after getting a letter from Trump postponing the trip in light of the government shutdown, labeling it a public relations event.
Being Speaker of the House and leaving the country when it's shut down, I don't think that's appropriate.
Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff berated Trump for possibly compromising the safety of the delegation.
I think the president's decision to disclose a trip that the speaker is making to a war zone was completely and utterly irresponsible in every way.
Schiff's comment resonates because President Trump secretly traveled to the region last month in darkness out of security concerns. Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, is second only to the Vice President in leadership. The partial government shutdown was triggered by a standoff between Democrats and Republicans over funding for construction of a wall along the U.S.-Mexican border. Several Democrats have taken steps in recent days to get an early jump on the 2020 U.S. presidential race. Democrats expect a large field of candidates will compete to take on President Donald Trump when he runs for re-election next year. But as of now, there does not appear to be a clear front-runner in the Democratic field, as we hear from VOA national correspondent Jim Malone.
Wow! Hello, Manchester!
Democrat Elizabeth Warren was among the first out of the starting gate, with trips to the early contest states of New Hampshire and Iowa.
Today, a minimum wage job in America will not keep a mama and a baby out of poverty. Think about that difference, because for me, that's what this is all about.
It's time for new leadership.
Joining Warren on the campaign trail is former Housing Secretary Julian Castro.
Together we will show that hope can be bigger than fear, that light can be bigger than darkness, and that truth can be bigger than lies.
Warren is one of several Democratic women either already in the race or expected to join it, including New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Hawaiian Representative Tulsi Gabbard, California Senator Kamala Harris, and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. Others considering a bid include former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, and former Vice President Joe Biden, who campaigned for Democrats in last year's midterm election.
The only thing strong enough to tear America apart is America. We've seen it start, and we've got to stop it now.
Biden may be the best known, but at the moment, no Democrat has a clear advantage, says analyst Larry Sabato.
And even Biden isn't a heavy front runner. He's been showing up at, the 30, 35, 40% mark. That's not nearly as good as some front runners like Hillary Clinton in 2016 at this time in the race.
Democrats should expect a crowded presidential field and a long primary battle, says Jim Kessler.
I think what's going to be clear in this nominating process is that it's not going to be a coronation like you've seen, with Al Gore over Bill Bradley, with Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. I think it's going to be hotly contested.
It's beautiful. President Trump remains popular among Republicans, even though his overall approval rating is declining. But Trump could face a primary challenge from former Ohio Governor John Kasich.
I would be running to be, somebody to try to bring the country together. That's what it would be about.
Trump's re-election focus has been to shore up his political base. That could make it difficult for any Republican to mount a serious challenge to the president from within his own party.
Such a simple statement, but such a complex thing to do.
Jim Malone, VOA News, Washington.
VOA Music Time in Africa host Heather Maxwell was in Togo recently for the launch of VOA's newest radio station, 102.3 FM Lome. While there, Heather spent some time with one of Togo's hottest young stars, Santarinos. Here's a look.
Santarinos, c'est la nouvelle étoile de la musique togolaise. Il a été primé au All Music Award dans la catégorie meilleur album de l'année.
Est-ce que Santarinos, ça c'est ton nom de star?
Oui, c'est mon blaze, Santarinos Raphaël.
Ok, mais comment tu as choisi ce nom?
En fait, Santarinos pour moi, San en espagnol c'est saint. Et Trinos, en fait, Tri, ça fait la Trinité. Donc j'ai dit Santarinos, c'est le Père, le Fils et le Saint-Esprit en un. Donc les trois en une personne ne peuvent être que source de grande bénédiction. Donc c'est d'où j'ai choisi. Et Raphaël, c'est mon autre baptême. Merci.
Moi, je remarque que la mélodie est complètement unique. Moi, j'ai jamais entendu une mélodie comme ça. Mais tu t'inspires de la musique traditionnelle ou comment?
Oui, je m'inspire de la musique traditionnelle togolaise.
Et tu chantes en quelle langue? Parce que c'est pas le français. Un peu mélangé.
Ouais, genre moi je chante beaucoup en EV. Certes, je mixe ça avec le français pour que les gens puissent, ceux qui ne comprennent pas l'EV puissent savoir au moins de quoi parle la chanson. Donc je pense que cette langue aussi est la particularité de fait la particularité de notre musique.
J'ai une grande chance de la voir. Ce soir, je vais lui demander d'être ma fiancée. Elle est la seule qui me comprend, la seule qui me connaît vraiment. Chaque temps, elle hante mes pensées. Abondance de bien ne nuit pas. Elle me rend tellement heureuse. Oh mon Dieu, je suis enjaillé.
Est-ce que cette chanson est sur le nouveau album?
L'album, oui.
Le plus récent?
Oui.
Oui.
Okay. Ça est sur l'album. C'est le titre qui m'a révélé au grand public. Donc voilà.
Tu attendais que ça allait être un succès comme ça?
Bon, à 60 voire 70%, je misais dessus. Parce que c'était mon tout gros, premier projet. J'ai beaucoup misé dessus. J'ai enregistré ça dans un studio pro. La vidéo, je l'ai réalisée avec le réalisateur qui avait eu les awards, le meilleur réalisateur du pays.
Ça, c'est qui?
Yos Messer.
À travers tes expériences, qu'est-ce que les Togolais aiment dans leur musique?
Dans la musique togolaise, je pense que le public s'identifie plus quand ça parle de leur vécu. Faut que ce que l'artiste chante puisse être un message dans lequel tout le monde, beaucoup moins la grande partie de la population se retrouve là, ils vont aimer. C'est la façon de chanter l'amour, par exemple. C'est la façon de chanter l'amour.
That was VOA Music Time in Africa host Heather Maxwell speaking with Togo star Santarinos. Welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. This construction worker is part of a team building an eco-friendly house near Ghana's capital city, Accra. He is employing an ancient technique involving compressing a mixture of raw materials, mostly sourced from within 2 kilometers. When the temporary structure is later removed, it will reveal a solid wall, the beginning of a house. The technique is called rammed earth, which produces man-made stone using force and pressure, as well as being more eco-friendly. It costs a third less than building with sandcrete blocks commonly used in Ghana. The technique is well suited to the hot climate of Ghana as it keeps the room temperature cool. Next up, a report by a high-profile panel of health experts say the optimal diet for people and planet would cut back on red meat and would boost whole grains, fruits and vegetables. The report in the Lancet Medical Journal sets out scientific targets for a healthy diet which will cut down climate change enough for our planet to be sustainable. It requires that over a third of our calories are consumed from whole grains and plant protein sources. Each person has an allowance of 14 grams of red meat and 500 grams per day of vegetables and fruits. The diet would require the world population to slash meat and sugar consumption by half. According to authors, the change would have massive benefits for health. One plant that's making its way into more and more food is hemp. In Australia, it's been legal to consume hemp food products for over 12 months now. Hemp oil seeds and protein powders, all sorts of products can now be found in local supermarkets. Protein-rich hemp is a variety of the cannabis plant, but not one that contains enough THC, the psychotropic chemical in marijuana, to cause any mind-bending effects. Now that it can be found produced for food consumption, Australia has access to a multi-million-dollar global market. New products like cold-pressed hemp milk can now be found on supermarket shelves, but consumers are still ill-informed about hemp, which leads to preconceived ideas about the new product, and that's what's trending today. That's our show for today. We leave you with this soul music by a young Kenyan artist, Kwame Rigi. Kwame says he's on a mission to revive cultural pride and consciousness. From all of us here in Washington, have a great week.